I think it would.
So I have to take notes.
Gets underway.
Which is normal, which is.
Now it's 7 o'clock.
And then when it goes there.
So I think I mean, the session is on 1 hour, 1 hour.
Yeah.
We will be doing these kinds of bodies.
What's that? Okay, sure.
And that's what now, let's look at anticipation.
So we have a note taker. Tony, thank you very much for that. If you want to JavaScript, please. Java, thank you. Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
Second.
I was just saying, they were just, but recently,
What's that?
On the back, things going on one for one. Domain. I think that I Yahoo account.
Oh, what could we see? Okay, that's
When the spice live.
I was sitting in
the 3+2.
We were actually just discussing that.
Oh, you were. Well, my capacity with the faculty would.
Right, so conveying seems I somehow missed. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Thorsten Lodderstedt, working with yes.com. I've got the pleasure to over the security topics draft together with Andre Labonnet from Facebook and John Bradley. I would like to talk about the current status of this draft, but let me start with the objective. So why did we start to work on this draft? Just to recapture, there are three main reasons. First of all, since we published Oauth, and that means RFC 6749 and 50, Oauth has gotten a massive traction, and what we have seen in the market is that people just don't get it right sometimes. So there are some issues out there that we never thought about that. There are some things in the spec that are not precise enough, or at least not actionable enough for the average developer. And I wouldn't blame the developer for that. So I think it's our task to be more clear and to come up with recommendations how to do it right and how to do it secure. Secondly, the original trust model of Oauth, or the original way Oauth was used, was rather simple. There was a service provider with a API and an Oauth server, and a lonely developer that developed an application towards this API and the particular authorization server. So everything had set up. At development time. So now things change. There are communities publishing APIs. There are communities in the financial area or in the mobile network operations area that build whole ecosystems based on OAuth and OpenID Connect. And in this situation, the trust relationship is established dynamically. And we have to cope with these situations as well. And third, OAuth is used all over the place, and also in areas which are much more security sensitive than we thought about previously. For example, in the financial industry, for health data, and a lot of other cases. So those are the three main objectives or main reasons why we started to work on this draft, which more or less sits on top of RFC 6819, the security threat model, and tries to complement that and make it more specific. Next slide, please. So the intention is to come up with a comprehensive overview on all the topics that are open right now in the wild, and turn this way, and to more or less systematically discuss all the different. No, there is no monitor. The monitor is off. Okay. To more or less conduct a systematical discussion about all those topics in the working group, so the threat analysis and also potential countermeasures, and then come up in the end, and that's the primary goal, with recommendations for developers how to use OAuth in a secure fashion, and also, and we will see, we already have one recommendation along that line, recommendations to all the OAuth working group either to change, extend, or enhance OAuth. So that's the idea. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the structure of the document is as follows. There is a really vulnerable threat analysis and discussion of the different countermeasures. And as you can see, there's a variety of different attacks angles that we cover in the document. So there is a lot of stuff around abuse or misuse of the redirect-based pieces of OAuth, namely open redirection, XSRF, code injection, mix-up, and all the stuff. With attacks in the browser, and we also have a section on token leakage on the resource server. And for those of you that were in Prague, we had a discussion in Prague about exactly this access token leakage thing. We discussed all the different countermeasures that were available and also came up with a kind of assessment. Okay, so this is more or less, that's where we document the results of our work, basically. and then we distill recommendations, and those are intended to be actionable for the average developer. Next slide, please.
Sorry.
No problem. That's the full list of recommendations that we have put into the document so far. I just want to briefly go through it just to make you aware of what we are going to recommend. So first of all, there's been a long discussion about redirect UI validation at the authorization server, and in our opinion, the only reasonable way forward is to recommend to use exact URI redirect matching, because that's one of the easiest to implement countermeasures against token leakage and also mix-up, or it's an incredency to over a protection concept. Open redirection, I think it's straightforward. XSRF, I mean, it's already there in RC 6749, but it's not as precise and specific. We make it more specific and say, please use XSRF one-time use tokens in the state parameters, period. AS-specific redirect URIs, use of that had already been documented in the respective draft by Mike. I think one potentially very interesting recommendation is we did a lot of analysis around code injection, and there are different countermeasures available, ranging from concepts in the OpenID Connect space like nuns or the hybrid throw and others. But in the end, we wanted to come up with a recommendation that is implementable on top of OAuth and does not require OpenID Connect. And that's why we recommend to use Pixie for that purpose, which might sound a bit surprisingly on first sight, but in the end, what Pixie gives us is a nonce that helps the client and AS to tie together the whole transaction, following the redirect and the interaction with the token endpoint. So I think that's why we think using Pixie for that purpose is a very reasonable way forward. Based on the discussions in Prague and also on the security workshop in Zurich, and also the feedback, especially in Prague, we decided to recommend as a best practice to implementers to use TLS-based sender-constrained access token methods over audience restriction or other methods for POP tokens, just because it's easier. We think it's easier to implement. And it's easier to implement, especially with MTLS with existing technology. And it goes back to the origin of OAuth, where most of the security is based on TLS and not on application level stuff. Yeah, and the last point, I mean, there was a discussion also in Prague, not in the OAuth session, but in another session. I forgot the working group's name. Was it the TLS where you presented your proxy thing? Yeah, Brian? Token binding, thank you. And based on that discussion, I also added some text about terminating proxies, TLS terminating proxies, the attack angles around that. And we think a reasonable recommendation is to use end-to-end TLS wherever possible. So this is meant to be a set of recommendations. It does not mean that people cannot do things differently, but we think that will make sense for 80% of all the implementations out there. Next slide, please. Okay, we also recommend one change to RFC 6749, because we think when we recommend Pixie for code injection along with exact URI redirect matching, then we no longer need to force the client to send the actual redirect URI to the token endpoint in the code exchange, which in our perception is not that easy to implement, which typically leads people to implement it in the wrong way by just doing pattern matching on that URL. And that completely misses the point, right? Because the actual URI is very important to detect some kinds of man-in-the-middle code replay injection attacks. So we think Pixie is the more effective approach. And we would recommend to issue an errata and change RFC 6749 to remove that, which would make implementation of OAuth a lot easier. Next slide. Okay, that's just kind of a status. So we published. Oh, Dick.
Yeah. So if you're taking out the redirect URI, would you be then saying that you have to use Pixie then?
Yes,
Okay. So it isn't just taking that out, it's replacing this.
you're
with Pixie.
right.
Okay.
You're right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. We published 2 versions since Prague, and the most significant change was that we added the text around token leakage at the resource server. I already talked about what we did. So we discussed extensively the use of more metadata to prevent that threat. Also, audience restriction is being discussed, and the different mechanisms that exist today for sender-constrained access tokens. And we restructured the BCP in order to improve the readability of the whole specification. The most important point from my perspective, and that's why I really try to talk you through the whole document and how it's kind of organized and what the objective is. Please review the document and give us feedback. We need your contributions, right? So far, I think 3 or 4 working group members have actively given us feedback, but I think this is essential for somehow coming up with a BCP, a best current practice document that we can put developers into their hands to implement OAuth correctly. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. So can we get a few volunteers to review this document? One, Dick, thank you. That's more.
Well, it's because I'm so slow.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Thanks.
Oh.
A couple of questions. I think I might have mentioned this in Prague, but one of the things that we need to be careful with this document is who the intended audience is going to be, right? Because when I first saw a previous draft before these 2 new revisions, one of the things that I expected to see in the draft isn't there. For instance, when I think of, let's pick on a mutual TLS, right? I would expect somewhere, some document of ours to say, here's what this does and here's what this doesn't do. Here's what you can expect to, here are the problems that your sort of use space. Now they can go to the mutual TLS document and read some of that. But when I saw the original title, going back to the very first slide, it's security topics, right? Where the document is absolutely dominated by threats and mitigations. I mean, 90% of the document is that. So I have 2 comments or 2 suggestions, and maybe this is a question for the working group chairs as well, is that if we go ahead and take this document, push it through last call and publish it, right? What happens when a workshop next year or the year after finds other vulnerabilities? Are we in a position where we have to keep revising the document? Not that that's a bad thing, but that's an onerous task for a working group, I think, over time. You wouldn't want to keep this as just an internet draft. You wouldn't just want to leave it in that state, because one of the things is it won't get the visibility it needs to have the intended effect for the audience. So I think, while I'm not doing a good job of saying it here, I think one of the things that needs to be thought about here is thinking about the audience. And one of the suggestions might be is to separate the threats and mitigations part of it into a separate document that then's easily revisable. And the other security topics, perhaps add to those security topics particular features of ways that we've extended OAuth, right? And what their features are. So that's, I want to stop by saying, I think this is outstanding work, okay? But now when I'm thinking about who's going to read it, I think, well, gee, are they going to see the things that they expect to see?
Yeah, thank you. Some thoughts from my side. Yeah, right now it's a working document for the working group. So the intention is to serve as a working document for the working group. In the end, I fully agree with you. We should somehow split that, because in the end, the recommendations are that what's suited for the average developer. We had several discussions about that, and we decided to first of all go with this single document. But the question is absolutely correct. Yeah. Do you want to say something?
Test. Okay. So one of the aspects is, and I believe this is a discussion that actually concerned a number of the documents, is if we have this issue of how do we make sure that when we update the documents, we actually then keep track of the latest state or evolving documents. A little bit like that, we had that debate in the native apps document as well, because things are changing, operating systems are changing, and the same is here, like threats change, the priorities change. So, and what we found out is that this whole BCP idea is actually pretty good, because we can still refer in other documents and in other publications as to a BCP, but keep updating the RFC. So every time you don't need to externally don't need to update your references either. It always points to the latest version of the document, and I think that ensures some consistency and durability, if you will. Of course, it still requires us to actually produce text from time to time, but my hope is that once we produced the initial thread document and a while ago, and then we piled on threads afterwards. So maybe the time frame between the publication of the initial document and this one was maybe a little bit too long. But it doesn't need to be on a, let's say, a yearly cycle either. So hopefully we are not going to see a tremendous amount of attacks every year.
Keep your fingers crossed.
Yeah. But so that's
the internet.
That's sort of my approach to it. Like, yes, we will have to update the document to cover new things as they come along. And this BCP concept gives us a stable reference to the outside world. Does that at least address some of the comments?
I think we have to work on our face.
Microphone.
Mike.
Sorry. Oh, I have to go.
Here you go.
That's a service.
Yeah.
I think that we have to have a schedule and stick to a schedule. Just saying that maybe the attacks won't happen won't help us. So, I think that, I don't know. I'm used to other groups where it's 6 months is a rule. You don't give up, because after that people forget what was the last version. So
yeah, well, we have some attacks that occur in a while, but they are often variations of the same issue. So once you describe those, it's not that we have totally different problems all the time. Luckily, at least I would say so, right?
Yeah, that's right. As I said, most of the attacks are either because there are some gaps in the specification, or we're not precise enough in the original RFC, and the second because of the complete change of the trust model, because of the use of Oauth today, which is completely different than when we started.
So I'll just follow up an answer to your question. I think I think BCP is a good model. Certainly better, for instance, DNSOP has a terminology draft, right, that they leave an internet draft status and they revise it over and over and over again. That's not a very effective model, because no one can see. It's very hard to find that document. Nobody sees it, and it doesn't get the gravitas that you would get if you actually went ahead and published a document. I will say, and I'll just put in this minor plea, is that if this document is targeted at developers, it's great, and that's wonderful. But remember that I think we see now that there are people that other than developers who are coming to us and asking us, what are the implications of this and what are the implications of that? And if this isn't the document where we answer those questions, that's cool. But we should potentially have a document where the target audience isn't the developing community.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. And obviously keeping the target audience of a document in mind is crucially important. We had this Oauth.net website to actually reach out to a different type of community and more the guys who typically may not read the RFCs. So that's why we wrote separate blog posts in a very simplistic way in some sense.
Who are the other people besides developers?
People who operate the server, who have more operational experience rather than writing libraries, for example. Like not everyone writes their own OAuth code.
Sure, but if you're using a library, you're a developer still.
No, I would make a difference between the persons who actually writes an identity management server, authorization server, from the person who actually just uses it. I can download ForgeRock and configure it, still I haven't written my own OAuth implementation. I think this makes a huge difference. For you, Amazon, it may not make a difference because you're a big shop, you write everything on your own.
I try to spank anybody that wants to re-implement an open standard.
Yeah, but that may be you because you like to.
I'm good at spanking. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna cut the mic. Brian, are you in line?
Yeah. So I had Dick Hart, Amazon. Well, I had a comment on this. I was waiting, and Brian was being polite and let me respond. There was a comment about breaking into two different documents, and I think that would be the wrong approach. Okay. I think you want to have at the top, people understand what should I do, and then as I've encountered many times, people say, well, why should I do that? Okay. And then there's links to why later in the document, so they don't think, well, I know better, the backing and the threat, and then they really understand why you're doing it a certain way. I think that's very important in security things. It's supposed to say, here's how to do it, and then people are like, well, okay, and they wiggle around, but they don't really understand why. And having the why, I think, is super valuable. And once again, kudos for a great job doing this.
Thank you. Which also would mean that we should have references between the recommendations and the corresponding threat analysis, which we don't have right now.
Yeah, I would highly recommend that. This is mitigating these things further down, right? And then similarly, down in the threat, it's mitigated back up, so people can easily see the reference back and forth.
Okay, thanks.
One day we should have an RC.
Yeah, I was standing so long I don't remember.
Poetry or?
I wrote it on a napkin. Brian Campbell from Ping. It's nice to meet you, Torsten. A couple of things that I appreciate the doc. I think it's really good. I did have one sort of meta comment as I was reading through it. You discuss in some places a variety of different techniques that could be used to mitigate something. And I think for someone that's not intimately familiar with some of the history of what goes on in this group, that it could be a little bit potentially confusing. And I think it might be helpful to clearly delineate between things that are sort of have been discussed as options, but aren't necessarily viable solutions versus the recommended approach. And there's a few of those. I can think of two offhand. One would be audience restricting access tokens. Conceptually, it works. There's not a great way to do it. You reference an individual draft that I wrote that the working group didn't adopt. So I alone wrote the text based on concepts that came from brilliant people like our co-chair. And so like a client couldn't.
So what you are suggesting is that also in the analysis, we should clearly point out what technique we gonna recommend.
Yeah.
For what reason?
Okay. Or something and qualify it, because you couldn't. A client couldn't send the odd parameter and expect to receive a audience-bound token because it's not standard. So, similarly with the mix-up mitigation, there's that draft out there that we sort of abandoned that recommends returning issuer but a client couldn't depend on that because it's not standard, it's not out there. It's useful for discussion, but I think saying a little qualification around that would be useful.
Yeah.
That's
all. Point. Thanks.
So maybe one comment about this. Would it make sense to put those that are not recommended as an appendix instead of keeping it in text?
I don't know. I
think that's fine. That's fine. The reason why we don't have the clear recommendation in the main body of the document is because we didn't have the recommendation section earlier. So we just have this. Oh, let's first gather everything together and have a discussion, and then we decide, oh, we need this recommendation section. So in the end, it's more for historical reasons that we do not really clearly speak out what. Okay. Yeah. Good. And we haven't had enough discussion in the working group for some of those topics. Okay. That's why I'm rather reluctant to recommend something.
But there are a few cases where it's obvious or known, and I think just a little more
clarification. Yeah. I mean, for the token leakage, for example, we had a very intensive discussion in Prague, and based on that, it's very easy to more or less point out why we decided which way.
Yep. And then just wanted to say, I follow all your reasoning, and I actually agree with the reasoning behind dropping the redirect URI sent to the token endpoint and why it doesn't work well in practice. But I am less keen on actually changing the underlying protocol, because I think just because the reasoning sound, there's ramifications of actually doing that revving or updating the core document and then trying to gauge. You need to have a new document that updates the core document.
No,
right?
we, for example, I think Thorsten was suggesting to use the errata process.
Ooh.
I mean,
Okay.
if we do not change the RFC, we at least need to recommend additional countermeasures.
I agree with that. So,
That's necessary.
taking into account then compatibility with the different versions would be necessary. I don't know if you can make a change like that in an errata. I'm not a process wonk, but I would say you can't because it's a pretty large normative change, but you're the chair. Anyway, so I agree with the logic, but I think we need to sort of co-chair. Need to tread carefully in that area. That's all.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
John.
Yeah, so as one of the co-authors, I agree with Torsten that, this was originally a bunch of different documents, a bunch of different ideas, and we tried to pull all of the options together so that the work group could make decisions. Now, us not making arbitrary decisions on behalf of the work group was actually perhaps difficult for us. So we've made recommendations, but it's still up to the work group to decide which of those recommendations to actually follow up on. And at that point, we can say, yes, reconstitute Brian's expired draft or do this or that so that we can actually make final concrete recommendations. So the recommendations aren't meant as we've decided the work group must do this. This is what we think is the best way forward, but the work group still has to make the decision.
Yeah. So I guess maybe it would be good to take if you guys could tell us when it would be a good time to do sort of a consensus call on some of the recommendations. But because one of the problems that we had back then was that many of the issues were not necessarily orthogonal to each other. So you couldn't make a decision on one thing because there were also interdependencies. So it isn't quite clear to me on like what's a good point to actually say, here's the thing that we are proposing, and then now we make a decision. But I saw this more as a work in progress. It will take you some time to work through all the details and the analysis.
Yeah,
and then we make an assessment.
And I have to say we're not through yet, but I think we have covered the most important points: the redirect stuff and the token leakage.
Okay, so you think
you're
saying that we should actually?
Yeah, we can have a quick look, but I think it's a good time now, and we can have another round when we have covered our stuff. But I think now we have covered the most important stuff because we have our ranking according to this. Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. So we will run a call, consensus call on the list to see whether we can cast those in stone and then move on to a couple of others.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, Brian.
It's all right.
Okay.
Hans taking notes.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Now,
Oops.
breaking the.
Okay, I don't know how to tighten it up
Do
again.
you want to take
That's
the
why it
mic?
was
Yeah.
long, because take the microphone.
There we go. How's that?
Good.
And this doesn't work. Okay.
No, you can't look over
I didn't memorize this deck. Okay, how's that? Okay. I'm still in the pink square. I think it's been about 8 years since I've stood in the pink square. Last time I was up here, I got a lot of arrows in me, so hopefully that doesn't happen this time. Next slide. So mutual OAuth. So this is a problem that we've encountered. That's Dick Hart. I work in Amazon. One of the groups I work heavily with is Alexa. One of the scenarios we have is there's two different parties. One of the parties that is public is the Alexa and Sonos. We want to enable the user to authorize each of those parties to call the other one. And so in the document, I call them party A and party B, since both party A and party B are both clients, authorization servers, and protected resources. Does anyone have questions about what the problem is? Is this pretty clear? Okay. So just walk through the current flow around what we have to do today. Essentially, we have to go through 2 full OAuth flows, which is even clunkier than just 2 different flows because you end up in the wrong place after the first flow, so you have to go bounce over and stuff like that. And we find if you've got an Alexa device, you install Sonos, it seems like it's probably a 50-step process to get it up and running by the time you're done. So in the first flow, you essentially go through, click to add Sonos, go to Sonos, you authenticate, you authorize Alexa to be able to use Sonos, the user gets sent back over to Alexa. Behind the scenes, Alexa goes and gets its access token, and then Alexa then redirects over to Sonos to get the thing kicked off again. Go to the next slide, and then Sonos redirects back over to log in with Amazon for the user to log in, which is confusing because, yeah, well, you're all like, why am I logging with Amazon? I was already in Amazon, but of course, there's no active web session. And so the user authenticates at Amazon and then authorizes Sonos at Amazon. User gets redirected back to Sonos with the Alexa authorization code, exchanges it. And then at the end, the user gets redirected back over to Amazon. So as you can see, this is a fairly cumbersome process. So the flow that we're recommending is essentially you go through the first flow, and when you're done, because we already have the context of the user both in Alexa and Amazon, is Alexa calls a Sonos endpoint. Sometimes I get these backwards in my head, but I think this is right. Calls a Sonos endpoint with the access token that they got from Sonos, so Sonos knows the context. They pass an authorization code, which then Sonos uses and completes the rest of the flow back channel, and the user doesn't see that. And so it's kind of like you just go over and you made one authorization, but the other one then happens behind the scenes. Okay.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah, so I've highlighted the one place that's different. That's really the only new addition is how do we get that authorization code in a different way. Next slide. So just to reiterate, the authorization context of the user is really represented by the access token from the other party. Questions?
So I do actually have a question about step 6 there. So you talk about Alexa calls Sonos token endpoint with Alexa's authorization code, or is that supposed to be Sonos?
No.
It's supposed to be the same token that you get.
So the flow went through, and at the end of the first flow, Alexa has an access token to call Sonos.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Now we need Sonos to be able to get an access token to call Alexa.
Mm-hmm.
And so Alexa calls Sonos with Alexa's authorization code.
Right.
And then Sonos calls back up to Alexa with that authorization code and its client ID and secret to exchange it for an access token, which then lets it Sonos have an access token for Alexa.
So that makes sense. Now where the steps before that, where do you get the Alexa authorization code from? It doesn't say that. What is it?
Alexa just makes it, just like how it would make it any other time.
I see. I see what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So at the completion, Alexa says, okay, you've completed. I now have an access code for you. I'm going to mint an authorization code representing the scope that you've pre-configured. So one of the differences here is the scope had to be predestined beforehand, but since you know the transaction you're in, you would know that in this particular handshake, I know what scope you're going to get. So you've skipped all the steps that came up to getting the authorization code. You're passing that back channel instead of front channel. And then, so that's the different part. And then after that, Sonos just operates the way they did before of exchanging that authorization code for an access token, refresh token.
Okay. Yeah.
Adam Dawes from Google. When and how do you factor in the Amazon consent to Sonos? You have 2 consents that the user needs to agree to. So I only see one here.
So the first one, of course, happens when you bounce over to Sonos, and Sonos is granting access. You could do it either before you even start bouncing over to Sonos, or you could do it after you get back because you're in the Amazon context. And so it's, you're on Alexa. So at some point in there, Alexa can ask for that consent. But you make a good point. I should highlight that it should happen, but it could happen at either time when it's in the Alexa interface.
And you should gate that using the access token from Sonos on the consent.
Right. Which could be happen a priori, and
Right.
then if you get it, you do it, or you get it when you get it back. Right.
Justin Richer, in step 6, is there value in using the authorization code as opposed to just doing a direct token injection there? Since Alexa is generating something and going over a protected channel and all of that, why have the extra round trip? Is there value to that? It feels like there would be, but I'm struggling to articulate what it would be.
We thought a little bit about that. We went with this flow because you got a lot of you minimize the change, and so the whole granting of the access token is the same process.
Okay.
Right, and so Sonos is able to go and get a access token the same way because there may be the reverse flow happens as well, right? Where you're starting in Sonos and you start off getting a token and then you're calling the other way. And so it enables a lot more reuse of everything as opposed to having a completely different path.
Okay, so it was more of a development pragmatism than a specific security requirement or something then, is what I'm hearing.
I don't recall security requirement. There may have been something.
Okay.
I'm always a little squeamish on just randomly handing out access tokens.
Well, yeah.
So that just didn't feel good.
And I agree with that squeamishness. So that's why I was wondering if there had been some analysis. But all right, thank you.
Yeah.
That answers.
Thanks for pointing that out, Hannes. Mike Jones was yawning for Justin's question.
You're the presenter.
Yeah. Okay, he was yawning on my answer to your question. Okay, I think that's, so the question would be, is this something that the working group's interested in? I turn it over to the chairs to see whether, whether there's interest in that, and if, I don't, I doubt if anyone's had a time to read the draft, so I don't know. Pretty tightly.
You made this, yeah.
I renamed it. I renamed it. Yes, yes. I named it how it was titled as opposed to how it should work, so it would be auto-parsed.
Sure. Yeah, but so in any case, we have to confirm it on the mailing list. But I'm just curious on what folks in the room think we should do with this document. Is this so? Let me ask: do you think that this is a question, a problem that the working group should be working on? Raise your hand if you think. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And raise your hand if you think that this is we shouldn't work on this. This is a dumb idea. Forget the dumb idea.
We'll just start off and we should work on it.
Those are two separate questions.
No, but yeah, if you raise your hand if you object, if you think we shouldn't work on it. Okay, that's pretty good. We'll confirm it on a mailing list. Yeah. So for the minute take, it was about 13, 40 people in favor and nobody against. Brian, you want to comment something?
I'm not against, but actually Phil just asked a question that I think I was going to ask something else. Did you look at any of the existing mechanisms, like doing something like token exchange to accomplish the same goal as
That's what we use.
for the same kind of thing?
Well, I think before you answer, I think my question was more about, do we want to have a description of that problem, and so people know how to, there may be multiple different ways of solving it, and obviously, as you can judge from these details, there's obviously a lot of work to do, and also your document, I wouldn't say it's exhaustive here. But
It's not exhaustive.
yeah, I read through it. Actually, I thought when I initially picked up the document, I thought that you are proposing a competing solution to the mutual TLS, to be honest.
That was that was my
already-
other comment is could you change the name again? Because I can predict right now customers asking for one or the other and getting the names confused and then having to explain it. And bilateral OAuth, or I don't know, anything that doesn't.
Oh, open to suggestions. Yeah. It was the one that made sense, that it's
I get it.
mutual, just like the other one has named mutual for the same reasons.
They both make sense.
Yeah.
I'm worried about the implications of
How about,
Okay.
living together
how
because
about
I know how these things go.
Reciprocal? What that?
Happy to discuss on the list titles,
Very well.
changes, yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Although it may make both of ours more popular. We wanted to use something that used a lot of the same existing machinery to minimize what somebody would have to do.
It's kind of the point of token exchange too. It's all just a call to the token endpoint with a token where you get back a
Yeah, but that's sort of picking up on Justin's comment of like, it's always seems a little worrisome to sort of, there's now two ways that somebody gets a token instead of one way they get a token. It was really, we had a different way around how did you get the authorization code.
Yeah, we definitely have to compare the different approaches and figure out
Yeah.
what's better, and also take Justin's comment into account.
Yeah.
Like have good reasons.
Yep, yep.
Okay.
Good feedback.
Okay, next one.
Distributed OAuth. Is there something called distributed already or not? Am I putting the stake in on that word to begin with? This one's a little more complicated than the last one. The last one wasn't as complicated. So as there's a couple of things I'm working on where it's much more distributed, the whole system. And so in the original OAuth, there was an authorization server. It had maybe one or maybe a few resource servers, and there was the client, and it was a fairly closed. You were going to Flickr to go and get photos, and so you knew who the authorization server and the resource, and those things were fairly related. The separating the authorization server for the resource server was a good architectural approach, and now people have been taking advantage of that, and the separation has become even more acute in a number of situations where the same client may have similar resources but have different authorization servers because those resources are in different geopolitical or different security realms, but the client has access across all of those. And so as you start to scale up and have a more distributed system, it becomes brittle where you don't have this what's the word? I had a great word. A priori knowledge of where is the AS by the client, that the client doesn't know where that is. And if it does know where it is, then you can't change it because you got thousands of clients deployed that are using that. And so in a big distributed system, it's advantageous at times to make a change. And so having a discovery process where the client learns where the AS is for a given protected resource, and that AS could change, provides a lot more flexibility in a distributed system. And so really what we're trying, that's the problem, and what we're trying to do is how do we enable discovery of the AS? And as soon as you do discovery of the AS, then you get a bunch of threats. So first we'll go into how do we solve it. I think my next slide here shows kind of a picture to give an idea around sort of the problem. So there's a bunch of geopolitical domains. Each of them has their own authorization server, and you got a couple of resources in it. But that one client wants to talk across all of those. And so it needs to go and get access tokens across all of those. You don't want the access tokens at one to be able to be used at another one. So you don't want the S3 server in China to be able to call the S3 server in the US or EU, for example. Anybody have questions on? I just want to make sure everyone understands the problem we're trying to solve. You understand the problem, Tony? Tony? Are you still having breakfast with me tomorrow? Okay. So the proposed solution is the client discovers the authorization server as it hits the hits the resource, and in the 401 response, it's told where does it, there's an issuer in that response, as described here. Next slide. So there's a number of threats that come up as soon as you do this that people have talked about a few times, and I'm keen to learn if there's threats that we haven't thought of and how we could mitigate and making sure that we have mitigated all the threats. One of the obvious ones is access token reuse, where a particular resource could use that same token at another resource that's looking for the same scope. The next one is you could ping a resource server and it could send information essentially for a different resource server, and then you use the access token at that first resource server, but that resource server then can go and use it at the resource server it's impersonating. So we want to mitigate that. And then the third is, the authorization server is malicious, either because the resource server sent you to a malicious one or it just became malicious itself. And so we want to make sure that the authorization server, because you have multiple authorization servers, that the client credentials can't be reused by an authorization server at another authorization server. And so the mitigation and the access token reuse, there's a number of ways on this. And so the way we were looking at it is that in the call to the resource server, the host that's in the TLS link is, known that the resource server can't impersonate, assuming that the TLS link is secure, the resource server can't make up some other statement as to which host it is. And so the host that you get from the TLS is saved from calling the resource server and used when you call the authorization server, and then that host is put into the access token, and then when you're presenting that access token to the resource server checks to make sure that it's an access token for essentially audience restriction. But that's how we get the signal for audience.
Yeah, so I think it's.
I'm going to wander around the room and get some water.
The same as the audience.
Since my mic moves.
Well, that's essentially the resource indicator draft that we did.
But it was a different name though.
Well, there's a problem with reusing using the audience name because it also conflicts with other things, which is why we changed it to resource from audience.
Yeah.
But
besides the name, it's the same concept.
yes, that's the one that we proposed and the work group didn't adopt.
Is there, while you're standing still, John, do you recall why the working group didn't adopt it?
I think Phil objected and there was generally angry words about resource metadata and how the problem should be solved. Brian and I proposed that. There was another proposal from Phil and Tony about trying to get Discovery to do it, and the work group effectively wound up doing nothing at the time.
There's been many proposals.
Yeah.
I'm going to call Jeff Sessions on that.
Phil claims to have changed his mind subsequently, Tony, and mind, I really don't want to comment on it.
Hi, Justin. So in any case, a couple of things here. One, obviously, you could have multiple resources at a given host, so this may not be the right granularity for certain setups, shared server hosting, things like that. You could also have resources that bounce around with, dynamic DNS and all this other fun stuff. So, but I think going to a slightly different layer now, because John brought up using Discovery at the resource in order to start discovering stuff. Once you start doing discovery at the resource server, you start running smack into some very real privacy issues in your design. It doesn't come up as much at something the scale of Amazon, but if you take the same concept and scale it down to a personal authorization server and personal, resources that you may be protecting, you go talk to a random server on the web, and it's not going to give you the data. It's not going to tell you who it's about, but it's going to tell you, I am John. Go talk to John Bradley's, personal use authorization server to get information about whose server this is. Oh, you just kind of leaked a whole lot of information about that. And this is particularly sensitive if you're looking at things like personal medical records and data stores for things like that as well. So if things do go in that direction with resource-based discovery, even just handing back the issuer could be very sensitive.
Agree, you are handing out information about the resource is sharing information about itself.
Mm-hmm.
You want to make sure the resource can't impersonate that information. And potentially in the draft, we'd call out that privacy issue so that people don't use it in a way where they're leaking stuff without realizing they're leaking it.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not a solution for everything. It's a solution for ones where this essentially is public data. Yeah.
So like there was
Your name?
sorry, not Sakimura and RI. Just like there was John's draft, there's an expired draft called Oauth Meta as well. It's actually tackling exactly same kind of thing. The solution is also very similar. And just the fact that something like this is coming up multiple times, I think it's the kind of problem that working group probably want to work on. Just my comments.
One more comment. The concept of issuer is an OpenID Connect one, and we haven't actually come to terms with, well, I mean, from a authorization server being identified by an issuer, OAuth doesn't have a concrete relationship for that. Okay, Mike wants to.
That AS metadata document defines issuer.
It doesn't define discovery for it.
It doesn't define discovery for it, but the issuer concept is well defined, and you can then obtain the metadata from it and validate the keys and whatnot. So it is defined for OAuth. This is, gone through IASG review.
The metadata is defined, but how you actually connect the two is the part that the working group wasn't able to come to a conclusion on. So having an issuer URI in how you get from that URI to the discovery document that we have. So there is a bit of a gap there that needs to be filled.
Solution. So in here, this.
Yes.
This is the issuer. Yeah. So
well, except that.
Well,
so you're reusing. Stuff from OpenID Connect is leaking over. So yes, there is.
Sorry, I didn't know that OpenID Connect had a monopoly on the term issuer. So
no, it's not part of an OAuth RFC. So it's
no in the document I define this as a new term. To need to call it something. Happy to have a different name, but it was since it. Yeah. Go on. Yes.
So, just for sake, in my draft, I didn't use the issuer. It was like, I forgot what it was, but it was something that indicates authorization server. That's it.
Okay. So it could be something like just AS or something.
This is Thorsten. Can you go to the next slide, please? Next one. Yeah. I like the concept of audience restriction. I'm a big fan of audience restrictions. As Annabelle pointed out in Prague, if you go for audience restricted also access tokens, means we need to extend the protocol, and clients need to be aware of that they need to ask for different access tokens for different resource servers. We did it at Deutsche Telekom, and we still do it without me. But if the working group wants to bring that forward, and I would really, really recommend to work on that because it's popping up all over the place. we need to consider that. So it will change more or less the semantics of the authorization flow. Or at least clients must be aware of the fact that it's not sufficient to ask for a single access token, but they have to distinguish the different resource servers, they have to send different access tokens to. The fact that we don't have consensus on that topic so far is one of the reasons why we recommend sender constrained access tokens in the security BCP.
Right.
Yeah. We have worked on an extensive document regarding audience restriction, discovery, and stuff. We haven't shared that with the working group so far, so we can do that.
Right.
But there's a lot of work to do. I would be very, very happy to contribute that work, and I really like that idea.
Yeah, I didn't call that out, but yeah, you are, well, I say it at the bottom, right? An implication of this is it requires an access token for each protected resource. And so the client's managing that, which your client's managing if they had a bunch of different authorization servers and access tokens, right? If you have a client that's calling Google, Flickr, and Facebook, it's got an access token for each one of those, and it has a separate AS. What this enables is that potentially the same AS may be issuing the same access tokens.
Yes, true, and it very, very well matches with all this token binding stuff and so on. We have done that for years at Deutsche Telekom, but the client needs to know how to ask for different access tokens. We did it with different scope values, right? So this is a different or a profile of OAuth that we use to distinguish the different sources.
Yeah.
So we have to agree on a way to do it. That's it.
Oh, and love to get your learnings and what you guys did to solve this, so we're not reinventing everything. Yeah.
Justin again. Speaking of reinventing everything, have you read the UMA 2.0 distributed authorization?
Not lately.
Okay, it's 2.0 is very different from 1.0. It is much closer to actually using OAuth, and I haven't read your draft beyond just a quick skim of it. But there's probably a lot of commonality, and I'm not saying UMA is going to be the end-all solution for what you're after. But you would do well to at least read and understand it and know what the differences are, if there are any. Because UMA sets out to do to solve a very similar problem, wherein you don't necessarily know the relationship between the AS and the RS ahead of time, and the client needs to learn that. UMA accomplishes this and accomplishes audience restriction using a ticket-based system. So the RS hands a ticket to the client then uses that ticket.
It's not that
all
I'm
that
not
other stuff.
familiar with it. I just haven't read the latest draft. Yes.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Okay.
So the problem we're solving here is a subset of that.
Okay.
And the challenge would be is like, we didn't need most of all of that. And so we didn't see that as being a solution.
Mhm.
But I want to make sure we also take lessons from that. And if it's possible to just reuse it, possible. But when I sort of looked at an older thing and when I talked to people at IIW about it, it seemed like there was an awful lot more stuff in the UMA.
Right. Have you seen a recent, as of this spring, draft of UMA 2? Like, how old is your old knowledge of UMA?
Well, I didn't read the doc, but who's the AOL guy?
George?
George.
Yeah.
I got an image of George in my head. Don't ask questions about that. Yeah, so he walked through me in detail on this draft and UMA 2 and how it compared. Right?
Okay.
So I didn't read the doc, but I felt that I was schooled in how it worked and how these things compared and contrasted.
Okay, that's good. I just wanted to make sure, because the differences between 1 and 2 in terms of the type of stuff that you're addressing are drastic.
Okay.
And so, okay. And you and I can talk more if you have more specific questions after I get a chance to actually read this.
Okay.
Thanks.
Got the line after Brian.
Yeah, because I have more slides.
Oh, you do?
Yes.
I wanted to reiterate that comparing this to other drafts that are very similar previously, one of the difficulties we had was defining the granularity of the protected resource. And you've kind of taken the easy way out going with host, which is maybe okay, but everyone seemed to have a different opinion on how granular that had to be previously. And that may well need to be looked at.
Yep, it limits what you can do, but sometimes limits are good.
I was on the other side of that and
Which
lost.
side? Which side?
Wanting to limit or
Oh, okay.
at least
So you like limits.
define it.
So you're my friend. You're my friend today.
I'm resentful if you get to do something.
Oh.
If you get to do something simple where I was not, that's all. It may come up. I don't know. It just,
Okay.
but it's a specific. It's saying that a resource server audience is at the host level. Period, and that may or may not be okay with folks. I did actually try to read the draft. It reads as though it's specifically and only for the client credentials grant type. Is that? But then you haven't talked about it here in the slides.
Yes, I think this problem maps well for two-legged solutions because many of the things you're trying to do are where the distributed natures come up as two-legged. Like, because as soon as you have a user involved, that the flows are radically different, and you know what the authorization server, right? It's quite a different use case.
Okay, so it's narrowly aimed at that.
Yes.
Okay.
Why it's simple.
But it's an important.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So and yeah, so like things like implicit are just
not part of what. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep. Let's go to the next slide. Because one way of doing it wasn't enough, we had a different way of doing it. So the alternative, as opposed to restricting the audience, would be to have in the access token essentially that the protected resource is able to look at the access token and there's an authentication when the client is calling the protected resource, and then the protected resource says, well, I got an access token that was for you, and was it you that called me? So you're essentially checking to see this access token for this client, and then this is the client that's calling me, and I know those are the same. So this one now, the client doesn't need to manage an access token because it's the same access token for all of the different places, but the protected resource needs to authenticate the client. And this maps, there's another deployment I'm working on, UTM, which is UAV traffic management, which is the drones flying around and how all the different servers talk to each other. And so in this case, there's a whole bunch of different parties that are all talking to each other, and the authorization server is the FAA that says, are you allowed to operate? And so the access token represents the authorization to operate, and all the different parties are essentially all peers, all calling each other. And so this maps better because you're not having it doesn't really make sense to have different access tokens for different parties because it's all the same resource. And by the nature of it, you want the client to be able to be authenticating anyway when they call, so you know who's calling you. It's not just an authorization. You want to know which party's saying it, and so you already have that piece. And so this maps better for them as sort of an alternative mitigation on replay. Next slide. So the resource server impersonation, really all the things to solve access token are solved by that. Next slide. And then the malicious AS, so at a high level, it's really you don't want bare tokens. You want to have some proof of possession so that the authorization server can't replay the credentials to a different authorization server. Those last slides are way faster than the one slide.
Thanks. So I sense there was kind of some good support for it. So can we get a sense of people that would support this working group working on this problem?
One comment. I mean, this sort of encapsulates a number of independent drafts that we have from the draft that Brian and I are working on mutual TLS, which is one of the mitigations and was called out in the security issues work, the resource indicators and some of the other stuff. I mean, we should, while I agree with having an overall document, we shouldn't lose track of actually having generic solutions for the broader issues. So if we decide to move forward with the mutual TLS draft and that fits in with this, then we can reference it rather than trying to reinvent the wheel.
In,
which-
in the draft I wrote, I referenced mutual
Yeah.
TLSs. I didn't want to like
But-
John, I see this.
But there are probably other components
Yeah.
where,
John, I personally see the different sort of threat mitigation things as references to other documents rather than, and the main focus of this work, and I think you got into the security aspects because that's obviously a big concern with that sort of dynamic nature, the dynamic discovery of the parties. So I think this is the type of thing I believe this write-up should be focused on.
right, but
And-
what I said with threat mitigations pointed back to Brian's draft, et cetera. So Torsten and I have identified this as a generic issue that we have to solve and have two different mechanisms that we've proposed. So we should attempt to, if we're going to solve some of these issues, we should try and solve it across both OAuth and this, as opposed to necessarily coming up with
I agree.
specific mechanisms for this.
But there's also the item that Justin raised earlier, that there may be some overlap with the UMA work, and I think we should clarify that as well.
Torsten.
Yeah, go ahead, Torsten. Yeah,
Just one comment. So, I mean, your proposal underlies what I said previously. So OAuth is getting more dynamic and so on. So more or less what you presented is along the line of the threat analysis we did for the token leakage. So, and you also came up with more or less the same recommendations. So I think we should somehow align that and prevent replicating the work. As I said, one of the recommended countermeasures to audience restrictions that I would like to bring forward. I'm not quite yet decided about that.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. I mean, that the goal wasn't that I didn't think I was inventing how to solve these mitigations. It was more, here's what we want to do. There's a bunch of threats, and here's how we would mitigate them.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. Well, because I stole some of yours. So,
Thanks,
yeah.
Dick. But Tony, you had a question, right? You want
microphone, please.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Here, Tony, because you're my friend, even though I'm not yours, I'll bring you the mic. Right here you go.
Your temporary friend. I think you were asking whether there was interest in this topic or this document. I would have interest in the topic, but not necessarily. I think with John and the rest, there's other ways to solve this, and so I wouldn't necessarily suggest adopting this document, but adopting the idea and looking at all the other things that have been done in this space.
Okay, thank you.
Am I still your friend, Dick?
So we have to discuss this, continue that discussion on the mailing list, unfortunately. Thanks, Dick. Okay, next, Marco. Yeah.
Hello, Marco Tiloka from Rise 6. I'm not co-authoring this draft, but I'm presenting on behalf of Samuel Erdmann from Spotify and Ludwig Sides, a colleague of mine. Next slide, please. Okay, first and foremost, the acknowledgement, of course, mentioned that this work is highly inspired by another draft, and Brian has also reviewed this very document. So thanks for that. So essentially, this document proposed two new client credentials to be used for authenticating the client to the authorization server, either based on raw public key and pre-shared key, to be used for establishing a TLS or DTLS session with the authorization server in the respective key establishment mode, and according to, of course, the respective specification to authenticate the client in the end. What is in scope is a token request or an introspection request at the authorization server, while what is not covered in these client credentials are the client binding of resource requests. And of course, this is also related to other document as to how to specify client credential using assertions, and on how to use S509 certificates as client credential if you go for the public key mode. Yes, and this document made particular reference on the one credential per client software paradigm, which is particularly common in constrained environments where this document was initially proposed before considering this working group. That makes particular sense because devices in such use cases are pre-provisioned with a symmetry key that can be used. In case of dynamic registration, this document also specifies new registers for new attributes, enabling registration for both cases of pre-shared key-based and republic key-based. And I think it's the last slide.
Is it? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
It's mostly moving the document to this working group from ACE, essentially.
Okay, so anybody has any kind of initial thoughts about this?
This is Justin. Would it make sense to merge this with the MTLS doc? No? Okay. I heard somebody grumble no, and I think it was Brian. So. And Torsten as well, apparently. And Nat as well. Okay, fine.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah, this is just to introduce the document right now. The last one, yeah. Mike, you had a comment? Go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, I have a clarifying question. Mike Jones from Microsoft. Are the keys represented in the discovery document or in the registration document as JWKs or references to JWK sets or references to JWK documents, or are they something else entirely?
I don't remember this detail personally.
Okay, I would have a problem with that. We should use standard representations for keys that this working group worked on.
Torsten, just want to explain why I said no regarding Justin's question to incorporate that stuff. I think that's important work, but as we want to move the current MTLS draft forward to a working group's call, I'm rather reluctant to change the scope. That was the reason.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks. Vittorio.
Thank you. Thank you. I am Vittorio Bertola from Open Exchange, and I thank you for having the opportunity to present some work that we've been doing. We decided it's time to present to other people and see whether we can get some feedback and understand where actually, I mean, if there are other people that would be willing to work on it with us, and where would be the appropriate place for doing so. So actually, the problem we're starting from is the state of online Oauth for the average user. I mean, there are better systems than this, but if you take the average internet user today, most of them just have 100 or 200 of usernames and passwords, which in theory are different, but in practice are being used constantly, and this creates all sorts of security and privacy problems. And there are some single sign-on systems that are gaining ground. Mostly they are, run by a few companies, and they are private. So, on more and more websites, you see people being able to log in with their Google or Facebook or whatever credentials, which is fine and very convenient. But at the same point, in our opinion, this is giving way to too much fragmentation and lack of interoperability. So, on some websites, you get a list of 15 different sources of credentials. You have to pick one from them. From other websites, only give you one of them, so you need to have a Google account to access the websites that only accept Google credentials, and then a Facebook account to access the websites that only accept Facebook credentials, and so on. So we don't think this makes sense, and so we've been thinking whether there's another way of doing it, so that implementers, websites, online resources that want to accept single sign-on credentials only implement one system, and it works with any identity provider, and also users can choose their provider. So if they don't like one particular provider, they can get an account from someone else, and they're not forced to use one specific. So next one. So we are an email company, by the way. So we just were wondering, why can't it work like email? So why can't you have a public, open and federated infrastructure in which you get your identity, your identifier from whatever provider you want, and it works on any website, any online resource, and you can actually get to choose it, to change it if you're not happy. You could even host it yourself, and if you're using your own domain name, exactly like it happens with email, you could even port your identifier to a different provider. So keep the identifier and have it managed by someone else. And I mean, we think that there's really a long list of advantages in a system like this. So, for example, I think security is easier because, well, first of all, you only need to remember and to secure one set of credentials, and also there's just one place where it gets verified, and there you can implement all sorts of additional security mechanisms without having each and every website or the internet implement factor authentication or whatever. And also, since we are, Europeans, we have to comply with the very strict European laws. And so we're concerned about managing the consent by the user on the data they share and their ability to update them. So to keep track of which information they gave to each website and to change it in an easy way, not having to retype it each and every time and update it in each and every website separately and so on. But in the end, so it should just work like you do in the real world. So in the real world, you don't have to register whenever you need to give information on you. You just show your ID or you just identify yourself. So we started from requirements. So first of all, we really think that this thing needs to be public and federated. Public meaning that it must be free and everyone can implement it. And I mean, we specifically don't want this to end up like instant messaging, where you have to have 5, 6, 7, 8 different accounts on different systems to be able to communicate with everyone. We wanted to reduce the implementation effort, so to make it easy, to make it easy for people that already provide identities so that they can easily make their systems and their existing identities compatible with this infrastructure. And easy for everyone. So this is why we chose to build over OpenID Connect or Oauth and over the DNS. So we chose to add the DNS into the mix. And this is also for, this is for several reasons, but one of them is also the fact that users are accustomed to DNS-based identifiers, to host names or to email addresses. Actually, the email address is often used by people as their username. So we think that this would be a natural extension. And so identifiers should work within the DNS infrastructure. And finally, one thing we decided is that we did not want to work with real-world identification. So this is not really meant to be a system in which you have to prove your identity. You could build some kind of third-party certification over it. So you could address the issue of certifying the identity of the user. But in itself, the system is just meant to replace what you get today by a username and password or by a simple account. So you could have multiple identities. You could identify with different identifiers in different contexts, and you actually get to choose how to use this. So yeah, I will give it to Marcos who's the co-author of the draft.
Thank you, Vittorio. Marcos Sanz. I work for the DENIC, the German Domain Name Registry. Next slide, please. So I'm working with Vittorio together on this, and we were trying to build this up. And the first thing we realized is we needed some things that were missing. For instance, the issue of issue discovery. We have it already there. So the draft of discovery just nonchalantly says, no, this is not part. It's out of scope. So so we didn't have a way. Yeah, it says so.
No, the discovery for OpenID Connect, which you're referencing, actually uses the W3C or the IETF WebFinger draft.
I'm talking about the draft of this working group, and it says, yeah, look at it.
I did mention that.
Okay, we went back to the one of the OpenID from the OpenID Foundation, and it uses WebFinger for that. Absolutely, yeah. But this the draft of this working group just doesn't talk about it. But we have a problem with WebFinger, and this has incredible operational challenges. If you have to run a WebFinger at each and every one of the issue of the identifiers that you want to use in the system. So if I want to use email addresses or I want to use domain names as identifiers, I would have to have a WebFinger for each one of those, and that didn't make much sense. So we came up with an easy solution is to do this in the DNS. We use the DNS for ISO discovery. And well, since we are a DNS company, he's an email company, when you work at the DNS company, then everything looks like a DNS problem. This really is a DNS problem. And well, we combine that with DNSSEC so that you get authorized source of information and integrity in the answers. So there are different ways to do this in the DNS. There are very, very trivial ways to do this. SRV record, NAPTA records, combine SRV with an NAPTA records, use something like WebDAV does. And what we do this is a kind of DMARC approach. It's a very easy TXT record that just says, okay, this is the place you will find your issuer. And that's it. Once you get the issuer, we bootstrap with the OAuth discovery and we get the metadata via WebFinger, but this is very easy because it's a well-known resource of the host. Please.
So you're sort of looking to reinvent. I mean, I worked on solving this problem back in 2003. What you're proposing here isn't radically different than what dozens of companies since then have tried to do on solving. I don't think that it's actually a technical problem. It's a how do you get people to adopt it problem.
Absolutely.
A number of us founded the OpenID Foundation to drive solving this problem because when we were in IETF, we got sent away numerous times and decided we'd go and create our own sandbox. And we had reasonable progress in moving it. We were a URL-based mechanism. We realized we needed to go to an email-based mechanism. But there had already been a little too much momentum in the older mechanism, and so there was reluctance to do that. And then Facebook came out, and a number of other things came out. And so the motivation for a number of relying parties to get a solution for how did it, solving their problem around how did you enable people to easily log in, the problem went away for those people. And so today, what motivates anybody to adopt a system? So that's one point. The other point is, I always laugh whenever someone uses the word auth in a discussion around identity because it's like, which auth? Auth-N or Auth-Z? My understanding that this working group is an authorization working group as opposed to an authentication, and as this looks like, this is much more of an authentication oriented solution. But I'm happy to let you continue on with your story here.
Thank you, Derek. No, absolutely. You're putting the finger in the wound. It's absolutely, it is. It's a challenge to try to convince somebody else to use this discovery mechanism, and it will be a challenge to try to convince the users to use this system of single sign-on. But nevertheless, we think it has advantages towards the situation that it's out there, as Vittorio has just said. There is a fragmentation. We observe a fragmentation, and we observe a problem of the identity of the users being owned by some companies and not being able to move easily their digital identity from company A to company B. So we really believe in the system that will even allow for self-hosting your identity. Hold on, I have more slides. just let me finish.
Yeah,
I know.
Yeah, so just one. We don't have too much time, right?
I know.
So-
It's just one more slide.
Okay.
Summing up. Just one slide back. Just wanted to take a look at the other points. Okay, so we are using we are separating concerns. We are separating the concern of the AES from the protective resources. The AES is the identity provider. The resource is the identity of the user. We are using distributed claims for OpenID to do this, but you are not very interested in OpenID, so I will skip this. We are adding additional mechanisms to the OpenID standard to be able to be compliant with European General Data Protection Regulation, like being able for the relying parties to communicate reasons why they would like to access some of the claims of the user, for the user to be able to make an informed consent about allowing or not allowing access to this data. Next slide. And well, what we have at the moment is this joint project between our companies. We have a prototype of the system up and running, and we are presenting it to different parties, trying to socialize the ideas. We have TLD registries that are interested in this. We have domain name registrars that host these domains and are interested to participate in this. We have interest of telcos and ISPs to be able to deliver identities to their users. We have two drafts. Next slide. presenting one, the discovery mechanism, second, the overall architecture of the system, and this is exactly what we would like. So feedback from the people, why this is a good idea or why this is a bad idea, review and maybe some guidance, where to deal with this. Is the IETF the proper venue? No, let us alone, go to the OpenID Foundation or whatever. So please.
All right. First of all, thank you for the presentation. Second, my main, this is Justin, by the way. Second, my main question to you is what makes you think this will decrease fragmentation instead of adding one more fragment to the pile?
Okay, this
beyond just hope that everybody will see that you're brilliant.
We really believe that this is a solution that could unify.
It could, but so could WebFinger if everybody ran WebFinger. Or OpenYOLO, or you know, whatever stuff Dick invented for you know, OpenID 2. There's Mobile Connect. There's a lot of great things that could unify it if people did this. And this is not the first DNS-based ones, which I'm sure you know that if you've done your research. Yes. So why this one?
Okay. That point.
No, that was a question.
Yeah, well,
is there not an answer?
The answer is we think that this is a superior solution to the situation that we have at the moment. And
good luck.
Okay.
That's Sakimura in RI. So when we were doing WebFinger, we also seriously considered DNS-based solution, and there were a bunch of constraints that didn't allow us to actually use DNS. So you probably want to look at it. The other one is that for the privacy notices and things like that, OpenID Connect already has this facility to do that. Third one, like somebody else has pointed out, this is authorization kind of working group. And maybe, I don't know, if I'm entirely unsure of it, but that if there's appetite there, but looks like it's a better suit for the OpenID Connect working group.
Okay,
I'd love to hear after.
One second here. So I cut the line here, and we're over time here, but
did you already cut the line, or have
no? After the review, yes.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Yes, I'd love to hear about the DNS challenges and problems you found. We have it up and running, but I really would like to talk to you afterwards about this. Thank you very much.
All right, Leif Johansson. So there are certain overlaps with the work in OpenID Federation work that's been going on in the OpenID community, but also in the R&D space. And one of the things that you're going to run into, this is not a question of getting it to work. It's obviously you can do that, but the problem when you start to scale stuff like this up, there are trust issues, and you cannot use the DNS to establish trust, because DLS and DNSSEC is based on a single root hierarchy, which does not map to practical federation, where you actually want to have overlapping circles of trust and much more control over where you get your keys from, how you trust those keys, and how you exchange them. So actually DNS is actually a poor model for you to build a trust infrastructure on. This is not just about, yeah, exactly. If you're a DNS registrar, then you think this is great, and this is not a this is not a criticism. We've had similar thoughts in SAML space and decided not to do the same, do it because of those reasons. I don't know whether you've thought of federation and trust establishment as part of your problem space. It may be that you've just thought about discovery. I'm saying that discovery is only sort of the tip of the iceberg.
Ron Gondwana, I'm going to make it nice and quick and just ask the question that I think was implied in that question a couple ago. Who has signed on and said, we'll do this outside this room? Because that's the real question. Have you got the big providers on board?
We're trying to do so, yeah.
Okay, that's cool.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for that space.
One last thing. in case someone is interested, I would suggest to have a few drinks or one after the plenary. It finishes at 7:40. 7:40. So at the registration desk, in case you guys. It was.
No. We're going to go to Raffles and have Singapore slings. Raffles Hotel.
It's actually a disgusting drink.
You don't have to, but you
We-
can have a different drink there.
Should we not meet at the registration desk because everyone will come out of there, or you don't think so?
Let's just go to where we're going to go. That way the people that are bored can go and start drinking right away. They're not sitting around waiting.
Okay, so does everyone know where this is? The Rappers?
Across the street. It's the White Hotel.
Across the street? Okay, I don't know it. Like I have to work.
The long bar is. The other ones are.
Which bar?
Wikipedia is your friend.
Rappers? Post them. No, don't post them.
Wikipedia is your friend.
Okay, do you guys know where we meet?
When you come out of the Fairmont, it's the only thing you can see.
Oh, really?
It is the
Okay.
entire across the street.
Yeah, it is a law.
It's the entire.
Yeah, it's the white building across the street.
How is it?
And it's the only building across the street. It's
Of course, you have to cross the right street.
Right, that's the problem.
Okay.
That's why it's called the Raffles Mall.
Yeah, so apparently I'm the only one who doesn't know that place. But,
Okay, thanks, everyone.
and